Hey everyone, it's Jeremy Signer, and today we're not only making one material, but we're making two really useful textures in Substance Designer. Now, if you've been following my channel, you know that I've been working on creating a sci-fi weapon for VR games for my portfolio. Along the way, I've been creating a short series of videos documenting the creation process of this asset, going from concept to sketch and reference all the way through to completed game asset. It's a great series for people to watch if they're interested in learning how a game asset, especially for VR, is created from start to finish. If you'd like to check out part 1, I put the link down in the description below. Now, the materials that we're creating today are inspired by this project that I'm working on, and because it's 2021, I figured it was time to start tackling metals. So, we're going to be creating two painted metal textures. One is a more coarse, rough painted metal, and the other is a bit smooth, but has a little more wear and tear. In addition to that, I wanted to show you how I could experiment in Substance Designer with the materials that I'm creating and apply them to my models, so I could do some research and development and tweaking on the fly. We're going to take a component from my model, import it into Substance Designer, quickly bake some mesh maps, and apply some procedural edgeware. It's going to be great. I'm super excited, so let's dive in. Okay, so here are the two materials that we're going to be making today. One of them is going to be this coarse painted metal here. You can see it's coarse by the bumpiness here on the back of this piece. And on the front here, you can see we've got more of a smooth painted metal, and we've added a little bit of scratches and some disturbance in the color here just to roughen things up a little bit, as well as add some metal edgeware along the seams here, along the edges of these pieces. One thing I wanted to mention is that both of these materials are a starting point or a base to fill parts of my model with at the beginning of the texturing process. After they get applied, I would then do some manual texturing to add more realistic variation. Also, subtlety is key here. I found myself really wanting to crank up the details in the normal map and the ambient occlusion, but in the end, I really wanted these materials to feel smooth while also having a tactile look. And that's where the subtlety came in. So let's go ahead and create a new substance graph. So File, New Substance. And I'm choosing the PBR Metallic Roughness template. And let's change the graph name. I'm going to call this Painted Metal. And for the tutorial, I'll just put tutorial. Size mode is absolute. And because I want some extra detail here, I'm going to be doing this in 4K. So the width and height is going to be 4096 by 4096. And let's keep the format at 16 bits per channel. Hit OK. And so to start off with, I'm going to go to the 3D view here. I have mine docked in the bottom left. You might have yours on the bottom here somewhere. I've just dragged these panels around so that we can reorganize them. And I just have mine on the bottom here. And I'm just going to give it a little bit more space because it's more important that we see things in the 3D view for this tutorial. I'm just going to give us a little bit more room. And it also gives me a lot of room in the graph editor to have this kind of layout. Now, for now, I'm going to go to Scene, and I'm going to choose the rounded cube. And that's because mainly these surfaces are going to be flat with some edges on it, and this seems to be like a good model to be working off of at the beginning before I add in the component from my sci-fi weapon series. Also, I'm going to be primarily working in iRay. Normally, you would have OpenGL here, and this is a really fast way to work, and you get a good approximation of what your material is going to look like. But because we're dealing with reflective, small details with the metallic and the roughness, you'll get a much more realistic result, and a result of what you're normally going to find at the end of the process when you render it out if we do it in iRay for this one. So I'm going to go to Renderer and choose iRay. So to hook up our 3D view to what we're seeing in our graph, I'm going to right-click the graph and choose View Outputs in 3D View. Make sure everything's set up that way. Also, I'm going to set up the lighting that we're dealing with here in our 3D view. There's a lot of setup for this one. So I'm going to go to my Library tab, and I'm going to scroll down. You'll see here we have under 3D View our HDRI environments, and the default one that we have here is Panorama. So you probably have Panorama applied right now. What you can do is you can just drag these in like I just did. So I'm going to choose Studio here. Just going to left click and drag and drop this into the 3D view. And this kind of HDRI map, these Studio HDRIs are really good for metals and hard surface materials. To rotate the light, hit Control, Shift, and right click. And we can adjust where our spherical HDRI map is in the scene giving us that natural lighting. Also, I want to mention, if you go to the environment menu in the 3D view and go to edit, you can change the exposure for iRay, and multiple times you'll probably see me increasing and decreasing this depending on how I want to look at things in the 3D view. And if you want to reset it, you can hit this X with the circular arrow around it to go back to 0 here for exposure. Okay, so to get started, let's do a couple things. First off, because I know that this material is a metal, I'm going to go to the uniform color attached to the metallic output that's provided by our template. So I'm going to click on that uniform color, and it's 100% metal, so I'm going to drag this all the way to the right to 1, and now this is a metal material. Next up, I want to make a way so that when I start creating the height information here, that it automatically reroutes all of its information into the normal and the ambient occlusion and the height. There's an easy way to do that, and I like to call that a final blend. So I'm going to hit spacebar and bring in a blend node, and I'm just going to comment this by right-clicking and adding a comment. I'll just call this final blend. And so whenever I plug anything into the foreground here of this blend, it's going to distribute it to the normal, ambient occlusion, and height. So let's do that now. I'm going to take this output of the final blend, put it into the normal conversion, and then I'm going to remove these two uniform colors that are connected to the ambient occlusion and height outputs. Just going to delete. And so I'm going to plug this into our height, but then we can't just plug this right into ambient occlusion. We have to convert what our height information will be into that shadowed ambient occlusion information. So I'm going to hit spacebar and bring in an ambient occlusion node, hook that up to the output for ambient occlusion, and then bring this connection into that node. So now it's a little bit confused because it doesn't know if it's color or grayscale information, but as soon as we plug grayscale information into this blend, it will know what kind of data that is. Also, I want to adjust the default uniform color here. I'm going to go to the value of this hue, saturation, and value parameter here in the color, and I'm going to drag it down something like 0.11. And so this will allow us to see a lot more of that reflection and surface detail in our texture. So the first main node that we're going to make is a noise, and let's go ahead and bring in a black and white spots 3. So that's B and W spots 3. Hit enter, and let's take a look at what noise we have here. I've chosen this noise because it has a lot of small, bumpy, intricate detail. I'm thinking that if my material had a bunch of these surface deformations, it might give me my desired effect that I want. So let's plug this into our foreground here. And you can see what kind of detail and information we're getting. And these small, intricate bumps are what I'm looking at. And you can see what that's doing to our reflection. It's really breaking up that surface, and it looks really nice. Now we can affect this even further by going to the scale parameter and drag this up. But I think what I want to do is increase it quite a bit more, actually. Let's increase it to 4. And now it's looking a lot more smooth. And so now I'm zooming in here, and I'm noticing that these bumps are looking a bit soft. And we can see that in here as well. The noise is still a little bit more soft than what I'm looking for. So what we can do is we can sharpen up this detail a little bit with a sharpen node. So I'm going to click on the black and white spots 3, hit spacebar, and bring in a sharpen. And now you can see it's created these more pixelated, sharpened bumps compared to our original one, which is a lot more smooth. And we can go back and forth here and look in our 3D view as well. If I go back to the black and white spots 3 without the sharpening, we've got a lot more of these bumpy, smooth waves and detail. And if you go back into the sharpened version, it's evened things out a little bit, but also added more of that tactile feel. Now I'm just going to decrease the intensity by double-clicking on the sharpen and bringing down this intensity slider. 0.25 looks good. And so zooming out on our texture in the 2D view, we still have these dark patches and these light patches. And I'm not really concerned about these large-scale details. I really want to filter these out. And the best way to do that is using a high-pass filter. So I'm going to click on my sharpen and bring in a high-pass grayscale node. And right away, you can see that those dark patches have started to disappear, and we can decrease the radius even further to remove them. So I'm going to make my radius really small because I don't want any of those dark patches, really. 0.52 is where I'm at. And now let's do a couple more steps to decrease the range of information that we have here. Right now, it's still too bumpy for what I'm looking for, and I want this metal to be relatively smooth, even though this particular material out of the two that we're making is more coarse than the other one. In fact, to distinguish that, I'm just going to go over to our unsaved package here, which I should probably save soon. I'm going to right-click on the graph and rename it, or you can hit F2. I'm going to call this Coarse Painted Metal. And I'm just going to save it. So to decrease the amount of information that we have, or to make it smoother and limit the range that we have, I'm going to add a histogram range. So let's bring these nodes over a little bit, select the connection between our high-pass grayscale and our final blend, and bring in a histogram range. And the histogram range allows us to select the range in our histogram of how much information we want and where in the position of our dark to light values we'd like to include that information. In other words, what I can do is I can change this range. So if I bring this way down, you can see that in our 2D view, everything's gotten a lot more gray and the values have decreased. You can see that the bumps in here have also decreased. If I adjust the light a little bit, it's gotten very smooth. That's a bit too smooth for me. Let's try 0.35. It's much more flat than what it was. Yeah. And it's smooth, but still a little bit bumpy. And to decrease that range even further, I'm going to go into the ambient occlusion node. And you can see this is where it's providing our fake shadow information. And we can decrease the height depth. Yeah, I've got like a really small number here, 0.12 something. And then finally, I'm going to go to the normal map, or rather the normal conversion node here, and we can decrease this intensity as well. So I'll just bring this down to 0.3, and it's even more subtle. But we still have that texture, tactile feel that we're going for. So those steps that we did to really bring down that range of information, we used a high-pass grayscale to remove these dark patches and really even things out. And then we used a histogram range to flatten things even more. Then we decreased the shadow information that we're getting from our ambient occlusion by decreasing the height depth, and also the normal information from the normal conversion node down to something like 0.3. And it's still there, but much more subtle. Next up, I want to adjust the roughness. You can see this is still a very shiny metal here. And I want to go for something that's a bit more worn. So I'm going to create a levels node. I'm going to click on my graph, hit spacebar, levels. And I want to use all of this nice detail that we have in our height that we've generated to affect the roughness of the material. So I'm going to take everything that we have in our final blend, and I'm just going to pump it into this levels node. And then I'm going to drag it over here and remove the uniform color that's connected to our roughness. And just replace it with that levels we just made. So already we can see a big difference in what's going on in our graph. And let's affect our levels a little bit. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this bottom left triangle and bring it in to the right. If we double click on the levels, we can see what we're doing in our 2D view. And this is brightening the overall image. Now, because in terms of roughness, the darker the values in grayscale, the shinier things are, the lighter they are, the rougher they are. So we've brightened things up, but we can also increase the contrast by taking this top left triangle and bring it to the right. If you'd like to see what specifically these values are for these two triangles, you can go to the top right here. We have these sort of bars and circles. Click on that, you get to the specific parameters here, and you got the level in low and the level out low. And these are the two values I have. You can see they start with a 0. So I'll just move these over a little bit, and you can copy these in. It's really just about 0.128 and 0.191 for both of those values. And so now if I look in my graph and I move the light around, and also I'm going to do what I said I was going to do, go to the environment and bring up the exposure a little so we can see a little bit more. Now we've got this subtle detail on this nice, cool, coarse, but mainly smooth painted metal. So that's everything we need for our first material. Let's just organize things a little bit. I'm just going to make a frame here by selecting the nodes that we made before the final blend, hitting spacebar and typing in frame, F-R-A, and I'm just going to call this base. And so now this is the base of our metal texture, and we're going to use something very similar to this in our more smooth painted metal texture. So let's go on to making that. Okay, so let's go to the package we created here, and let's right click and choose New Substance Graph. And I'm going to keep everything the same template, PBR metallic roughness, and let's change this to smooth painted metal. Absolute, 4096, and 16 bits per channel. Okay, fresh new graph. Like before, I'm going to go to the uniform color that's connected to the metallic output and bring this all the way to the right because this is a metal. I'm going to change the uniform color down to something low. 0.2 and the value is fine. And let's make that final blend. So spacebar blend. And you don't have to make a comment, but I will just to keep things organized. Final blend. And let's hook this up again. So normal conversion node. Let's delete those two uniform colors. Connect the blend to the height. Add an ambient occlusion node. Connect that to the output. And connect our final blend into the input of that conversion. So, like before, I'm going to get a black and white spots, BNW spots 3. We're going to create a base very similarly to how we made the last base on our coarse metal. This time, I want my scale to be a little bit different. I think I'm just going to do 3 instead of 4. Yeah. Let's plug that into the final blend. And that's a really cool texture already. Then instead of sharpening it, I'm just going to use a high pass grayscale. And let's bring down that radius again. Something very small. 0.52 to get rid of those dark patches. And after that, I'll add a histogram range. You can see how that affects it already. I'm going to really bring down the range here because I want this to be a lot more smooth. 0.2. I'm going to go over to my ambient occlusion, and I'm going to dial in a number here. How about something like 0.01? Really small height depth. You can just barely see it here. So we can get a tiny bit of those crevices and bumps. And then for the normal, let's bring down that intensity quite a bit as well. 0.22. Yeah. Zoom in a little bit. You can see, yeah, getting some of that detail. So for this time, instead of putting more detail into the height, I want to vary the patterns in our material's roughness instead. So let's organize a little bit. I'm just going to select these. I'm going to frame it up, and I'm going to call this base, just like we did in the last one. And I'm just going to bring it down here along with our final blend. So now we're talking about roughness. Let's add some maps to throw in that variation. We can use like a grunge map. So spacebar, grunge map, and I know that I want to use something like grunge map 14. And the reason why I like this one so much is it has these really cool scratches and awesome wear detail. Really like these brush strokes, and I think this is going to go really well with the style that I'm looking for. After this grunge map, I'm going to bring in an invert grayscale. I'm going to reverse this. And then I'm going to bring in a levels. So let's hook this up into the roughness. I'm going to remove the uniform color that came with the template that's connected to our roughness output. And let's just connect that levels to our roughness and see what we're getting. Now already we can see some really cool detail in our roughness, but we do need to adjust this quite a bit because right now it's overkill. So I'm going to double click on my levels, and I want to go to the bottom right triangle and bring this to the left. And you can see that sort of flattening out our values here. We're just bringing down the white clip. So things are going to get a bit more shiny, but they're really just compressing that information down. And if you want to see what I'm using this value here, 0.6766 for the level out high. That's this one right here. Now, I realize this still looks a bit weird, but let's add another level of roughness detail. And this time we're going to make some scratches. In fact, we're going to create 2 levels of scratches. So first off, I'm going to hit spacebar and bring in a scratches generator. This node is amazing for adding procedural scratches. You can see we've got some already in here, a bunch of splines in a wiggly fashion, all in random directions. It's really great. I want to change 2 parameters in this scratches generator. The first one is the spline number. That's how many scratches we have. And I'm going to put in 100. Just going to dial it down a little bit less. And then what I want to do is I want to go down to the spline distortion frequency. You can see what it's doing here. If I increase it, you can see those waves are getting a lot tinier and sharper. We're getting these interesting scratch detail. But now if I bring this down, the frequency decreases and it's a lot more smooth. And that's what I'm going for. I want it to seem like the scratches and nicks were made by fast moving either projectiles or the surface was hit by something that was moving rather quickly, and you won't get very jaggedy scratches like that. They're much more smooth and deliberate. What I want to do is I'm going to eventually blend this scratches generator with another form of scratches. So I'm going to bring in a blend node and I'm going to put this scratches generator into the foreground, and I'm going to set this blend mode to add. And so what are we going to add to these scratches? Well, let's bring in another map. Now, Substance Designer comes with another awesome map for scratch damage, and let's import it now. I'm just going to hit spacebar, type in scratch, and you can see we have a couple of preloaded maps here. I'm going to choose the scratch damage. And so it's going to give you the option to link or import resources. I'm just going to link them because I don't want my file size of my graph to be any bigger than it has to. So link resources. And here we go. This is the map that we have. We've got these cool larger scratches. It's a very useful grunge map. So when you import this map, you can see by this orange dot here that it's giving out color information. And we really want it to be grayscale information. So let's convert it. I'm going to click on the bitmap, hit spacebar, and type in grayscale to get the grayscale conversion node. So now it's grayscale. And after this grayscale conversion, let's bring in a histogram scan node. So we're going to use this histogram scan to determine the intensity of this variation of scratches. And if you'd like, you can publish this node's parameters by going to this top right here in the attributes and choosing batch expose parameters, or you can choose a specific parameter that you'd like to expose as well. And this will expose these parameters to the graph level, making it easy to adjust how much wear and tear you'd like in this texture. Now you can learn a bit more about exposing parameters and functions with the video that we did by creating a really cool picture frame utility node. We talk all about exposing and adjusting functions and parameters. You can check that out in the top right or down in the description below. So let's adjust this histogram scan so that we can filter in some of these scratches. Really cool. So if I go to the position here and I just drag this up, we're going to get more and more of these scratches appearing in our texture. I can increase the contrast to really tighten in what we're filtering. So just kind of inch these up more and more. I can choose how much wear and tear I'd like. I think let's lower the contrast a little bit. And we'll start small. Let's go with 0.22 on these scratches. We're getting a tiny bit of these nicks and detail. And so let's plug this histogram scan into the background input of our blend and see what we've got. Yeah, that's looking good. So now after this blend, I'm going to add an invert grayscale. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to invert this map so that when I convert this into normal information, the scratches will dent inward. So we're going to use these scratches in 2 places. One in the roughness map, which we're currently working on, but the other is the normal map. And so if we input these scratches into the normal map, we can make it look like the surface indents where these scratches are, and that adds a bit more realism. So like I said, I've inverted it so that the scratches go inward. And now let's convert it to normal information. So I'm going to hit spacebar, choose normal. You can see now we have these scratches indenting in our normal. And I'm going to bring down the intensity quite a bit. So let's go 0.05. Very subtle here. And now let's add it to our normal. Now what I want to do is I want to blend these 2 normal maps together, because remember, from our base we already have some normal information that's causing our texture to have some bump in it. So what we can do is we can use what's called a normal blend node. So normal blend, bring in that node. And right away, whenever I use this node, I think I need to click this button right here, which is use mask, and I need to set it to false. Otherwise, you're not going to see anything happen, and I've always plugged things in, and unless you have something plugged into this mask, which we're not in this case, nothing will happen. So make sure that use mask is false in this case, and let's combine these two normal maps. So here's the other normal map. Let's put the scratches normal map into the foreground, normal FG, and the other normal map into the normal BG or background. Double click. And so to blend these two together, we just need to adjust this opacity slider when we double click on the normal blend. And I'm just going to make it an even split. So 0.5 right in the middle. And now we have both. So let's bring that normal blend and connect it into the normal output. And now we're going to start to see some scratches appear. There you go. So this is still looking like a bit of a mess, and that's because we now need to blend these scratches with this other roughness variation to even things out. So I'm just going to organize a little bit. I'm going to put my normal nodes with the normal output. And what I want to do is, after our grunge map 14 that we have here, before its invert grayscale, let's make some room. Let's select the connection and add a blend. This is where we're going to blend these two together. So automatically you see that the grunge map 14 was put into the background. And so when we select a connection and add a blend, that's where this is going to go. So grunge map 14 in the background. And before the invert grayscale with the scratches, let's take this blend and put that into the foreground. We just have this invert so that the normal map indents. So we've plugged that scratch blend into this blend, double click on this new blend that we've made, and let's bring down this opacity a little bit. 0.85. And now we're starting to see this material come together. It looks a lot more smooth, and we get that slight roughness variation along with our scratches. And if we zoom in and change the light a little bit, we can see that these scratches have indents and that they're adjusting with that roughness. So let's organize ourselves a little bit. I'm going to select these nodes here on the bottom. This is just a regular roughness here. Frame it up and call it roughness. And then everything that we did with our scratches, except for the normal information, I'm going to frame that up, call it scratches. And this is what we have in our graph so far. We've got our base that we made. We've created some roughness, added some scratches, and put those scratches into our normal information. Now, this second material is all about adding layers of variation and how we can show it using multiple channels or maps that we have, like roughness and color. So now let's add some color variation. So what we need now are two similar colors and a mask to blend them together. So I'm just going to use this top right space here for our color information. And I like to do that because the base color output is right here. So what I'm going to do is add a uniform color, spacebar, uniform color, and I'm going to set this to grayscale just to keep things simple. And I need two of them, so I can either Control-C, Control-V to duplicate, or I can click on it and hit Control-D to duplicate. So I want a slightly lighter color and a slightly darker color, all in this gray area. So the top one I'm going to double click, and let's bring up the value here. Not too bright. Let's go with 0.21. And now for the darker one on the bottom, I'll double click that. Something like 0.19. And so you can see they're slightly different. And for the mask to blend the two, let's bring in another grunge map. So spacebar, I'm going to type in grunge map. I think I'm going to do grunge map 7. And so this grunge map is similar. You can see you've got those kind of paint strokes or scratches. And so this is the mask that will blend these two together. Let's get that blend node. With the blend set to copy, I'm going to put the lighter uniform color in the foreground and the darker one in the background. And let's connect the grunge map up to the opacity. Now you can't see very much difference here. And that's mainly because this grunge map is not very contrasty. There's a lot of grayscale values in here. So let's adjust this grunge map a little bit. I'm going to select the connection between the grunge map and the blend and bring in a histogram scan. I always use histogram scans when it comes to adjusting masks. I'm just going to slightly bring up this position, and I can adjust the contrast. I do want to tighten up this mask a little bit, so something, 0.24, zoom in here. That's looking pretty crisp enough. I really want to create these splotches of color. So now when I go into this blend, you can see that we've got, it might be tough to see with YouTube compression, but we'll see it in a second down here. We've got these nice clean splotches of different color variation and wear and tear. So let's plug that into the base color. So plug this into the output, delete this uniform color. Now we've got these nice subtle splotches of color on our material. So just like before, I'm just going to select these, frame them up to keep organized, and call this color variation. And there we go. This is the graph for our more smooth painted metal. So we've got our base, our roughness, our scratches, and our color variation. So we've got our two materials. Now let's use Substance Designer to apply them to a mesh and do a little bit of R&D testing. I like to do this within Substance Designer because it makes it really easy to visualize these materials on the actual model and mesh that I'm using, while also maintaining the power and control that I have with adjusting each node. So I can make any specific change I want with any of those nodes and apply them to the model instantly, and I don't have to import and export all these textures over and over again. We can also see what it's like to quickly add some procedural metal edge wear to the mesh, and this gives me an idea of what I can expect to see further on down in the texturing process when I'm using Substance Painter. So let's take a look at the component that I'll be working on. Okay, so we made a quick pit stop into Cinema 4D, and I just wanted to show you what I've done to this mesh to prepare it to be used in Substance Designer. So all I've done is I've just applied two different materials here to different parts of the mesh. So we've got one part here, which is blue, one part here that's green. These are just two different materials, and the colors are not going to transfer into Substance Designer, but I just did that to show you where they were. Just two different materials assigned to two different parts of the mesh. I've also done a very simple UV unwrap. This is using a piece of software called Rhizome UV, but I've just done a quick unwrap of the main part of the materials. Really what I wanted to focus on was hiding the seams, mainly up here on the top. I just have this part as one big unwrapped piece here, and then just a couple of unwrapped pieces behind it. And I've kept it all in this 0 to 1, one tile, one UDIM as it were, texture space. Okay, so back in Substance Designer, and I'm in the coarse painted metal material right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the package here, not the graph, but the package, right click that and go to Link 3D Mesh. I'm then going to double click the mesh that I created. And in this case, it says that the mesh is unwrapped on multiple UV tiles. I don't think that's true, but that might have something to do with what Rhizome UV did to unwrap it. So I'm just going to say, no, I do not want to use it as a UDIM mesh. And so now if I scroll down here, Substance Designer's created this resource folder. And here is my component. It's called Deflector Defined. And so what I can do is I can drag this into the 3D view. So you can see that's kind of reset my view a little bit here. And now we can just kind of set it to the way we want to view this object. So first off, what I want to do is I want to get my environment back to the way it was. So I'm going to go to my library and I'm going to find that Studio HDRI. Here it is. Just drag that in. I'm going to go to Environment, Edit. And I don't want to see this environment in the background, although that is useful to see what Substance Designer is doing, where it's projecting that light from our HDRI. I'm just going to turn it from is visible to false, like that. So we're still getting that light, but now we're not distracted by what's being seen in the background. Next up, I want to assign these two material graphs that we have to those two materials, those material slots that we made when we assigned materials to the object. So what I can do is I can right-click on the graph that I want to assign and choose View Outputs in 3D View, and now it gives me a list of the materials that I assigned and what I called them. Now, I didn't name them, so this is a bit confusing for me. You should do better than I did. But I'm going to define this to what I think is default 1. Is that the right one? Yes, okay. So that's this part. That's the part where I wanted to have the coarse metal, and you can see it assigns it just to that part in my object. I'm going to do the same thing, right-click on the other one, the smooth one, View Outputs in 3D View, and now assign it to the other material slot. So now we can see what these two materials look like applied to my 3D mesh. And so I can zoom in here, I can have a look. Again, subtlety is key here, but I think what I'm going to do is change the exposure on the environment just so I can look at that subtle detail. And I can tell if this material is defined well or not, or if I need to increase or decrease the roughness. And overall, I think for this demonstration purposes, I think it's looking okay. Now, this does look good, but let's step it up a little bit with some procedural edge wear. I need to see if these materials look like they'd wear out realistically around the edges. So this is where we come into some really cool Substance Designer features, like map baking. So I'm going to bring in a node into my graph here. Again, I'm in the Coarse Painted Metal graph. Spacebar, and I'm going to bring in Metal Edge Wear. Really cool node. This adds our procedural edge wear using some maps that we have to input into it in order to know where to put this edge wear. So what do I mean by that? Well, we need to get some information from this 3D mesh in order for Substance Designer to know where the edges are, where it can add this detail. And so we need an ambient occlusion, curvature, position, and world space normal map. So to get those maps, let's go to our Explorer tab here. And I'm going to find my 3D mesh. This is the deflector defined mesh that we dragged into the 3D view. I'm going to right click that and choose Bake Model Information. And it's going to bring up this window. So now it looks a bit complicated, but I assure you it's actually very intuitive and very useful. So we can see the UVs, or 2D view, of the mesh that we're baking information from. So what we need to do is we need to choose which maps we'd like to bake. So we go down to the Baker's render list, and we have this Add Baker pull down. So we click on that, hold down, and we can choose from all these different maps to bake. So like I mentioned before, we need ambient occlusion, curvature, position, and the world space normal. So we can go ambient occlusion, and I want to get the ambient occlusion map from mesh. That's very important. Make sure you choose the from mesh option. I also want to get the curvature. So let's get the curvature map from mesh. I'm also going to add the position map from mesh and the world space normal. This one does not have a from mesh on it, just world space normals. Now it's very important. You're not going to be able to start this until you click this tick right here that says use low as high definition. Now, what you can do with Substance Designer is if you have a high poly version of this geometry, let's say you've sculpted something with a lot of density in ZBrush, or you've just added a bunch of small details into the model itself with geometry, you can use that as a high definition model and then bake all of that ambient occlusion or normal information into the low resolution model with maps. In this case, we're not going to do that. We just need to get a little more information about the mesh that we've imported. So I'm just going to tick this as use low as high definition. And now all you have to do is hit start render. Okay, it's done. So I'm going to hit close. And now we've got these 4 maps in our resources folder in our package in Substance Designer. So to quickly add these into our graph view, I'm just going to click on one, hold shift, and click on the bottom one to select them all. Just drag them into the graph, and they're now evenly distributed here for us to use. So let's hook these up. This is the ambient occlusion. And if you don't know which map this is, you can click on it and look in the top right here under the parameters. You can see it says ambient, or you can look up here, ambient occlusion map in the 2D view. This one is the, if I double click on it, curvature map. So let's drag this into the curvature input slot to our metal edge wear. This one is position and world space. Now, if I double click on this metal edge wear, you can see it's found our UVs and starting to add some information to it. But now let's view this in the 3D view. So what I can do, because we're looking at the coarse painted metal graph, I can plug this right into our base color. And now let's see what it's doing. It's detected the edges and adding some edge wear to our texture. Really cool. So really what this is it's building a mask for us where we can switch between 2 different shades of gray, for instance, for this material, which is exactly what we did with our smooth painted metal texture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this connection just for now. And I know that I have this uniform color that we had before. This is just a uniform color with a value set to 0.11. Let's add a lighter uniform color as well. So spacebar, uniform color. I'm just going to bring up this value a little more. Actually, I'm going to crank it up a little bit so that we can really see what's going on with the edge wear. So 0.35. And so now we have these two. And just like before, let's get a blend. And let's take the output of this metal edge wear mask that we've made and put it into the opacity slot of the blend. Put the bright and dark colors in and connect that blend to our base color. So now we can see that edge wear. So now, if we go to this metal edge wear node, we can change some of these parameters. We can change how much wear and tear there is. So I can just bring this wear level down. And now it's very subtle edge wear. Let's pick some arbitrary values here. How about 0.35 for the wear level? I don't want any contrast, so I'm just going to bring the contrast down to 0. Now you can see a lot more of these thin lines. I don't want any smoothness, and let's decrease the grunge amount. This ambient occlusion masking slider determines how much it's using that ambient occlusion map that it baked. And I think I want to decrease it a little bit. Actually, quite a bit. Nice. So by plugging that into the base color, we can really see what the edge wear is doing in this case. I also want where the edge wear is to not just affect the base color, but I also want it to affect the roughness. So we're going to do the same thing we did for the base color. This time we're just going to do it with the roughness. I'm going to move this base frame and this final blend over. And I've got this levels here that's controlling the roughness of our coarse painted metal material. And what I want to do is duplicate it. And let's create a more shiny or less rough version of this levels. So I'm just going to take the bottom left triangle and bring it all the way to the left. That's going to darken everything here and make things a bit more shiny. I'm also going to take this bottom right triangle and slide it to the left, and that's going to darken the image as a whole and make things even more shiny. Now, if you'd like to see what value I've put in, I've put something like 0.56, and that's what it looks like. So now let's blend those two together using our metal edge wear mask. So we'll put the bright one in the foreground, dark one in the background, and let's bring in our mask into the opacity slot. So now let's connect this blend, let's make things look a little nicer here, into the roughness. And so actually what it looks like here is this is a bit shinier, and I've got my colors reversed. So what I can do is I can select the foreground and background connections, hit X, and that's just going to switch them up. And now we've got the more rough main area of the coarse material, and then it's shinier over the edge wear. And I can just switch these two so it makes more sense visually where they're going. So let's frame this up. I'm going to call this edge wear. And I can do the same thing up here. I think I'm just going to call this base color. Or maybe just color. Hit save. And now let's do the same thing to our smooth painted metal texture. So bring in a metal edge wear node. And let's connect up all of those maps just like I did before. Shift and clicking on all these to select them and just dragging them in. We've got our ambient occlusion, curvature, position, and world space normal. Oh, I've accidentally dragged that. If you've done this by accident and put it in the wrong connection, hit Control and click and drag just to put that in the right space. And then you can select this connection and delete it. Great. In this case, I just want to adjust the color. So we've got this color variation frame up here with our information. Now I just want to create a lighter color variant to show where our edge wear is. So spacebar uniform color. And let's just bring down the Explorer here so we can see more. I'm going to adjust the value to something pretty high, 0.64. And let's create a blend node. I'm going to put the uniform color in the foreground and put the darker information, everything else from our color variation, this blend here that combines the two, into the background. And now I'm going to take our mask and put it into the opacity slot. And so now you see you've got a red connection here, and that's because when we created these uniform colors, we made them grayscale, and this is giving out grayscale information. And in a blend node, you can't mix color and grayscale information together. So there's a couple ways we could change this. You could either click on the uniform color and change it to grayscale, or you can convert this information into color information by selecting the connection, hitting spacebar, and just bringing in a gradient map. And that automatically converts it to color information. So either one works, depends on what you'd like to do. I'm just gonna leave it like that for now. And so let's bring in this new blend into the base color so we can see what we're doing. And we've got our edge wear. Now that's a lot of edge wear. Looks really cool, but let's dial it down just a little bit. So like we did before, let's go to the edge wear node and we can change our parameters here. Bring down the wear level. 0.39, yeah, looks good. Contrast is 0.09. I'm gonna keep the edge smoothness and maybe just bring down the grunge amount just a tiny bit. What I could do though is I could increase this grunge scale. And now you can see we've got our edge wear here. And that looks really good. So I'm just gonna frame these up. Again, call them edge wear. And you can see with just a simple node, we can now visualize what this looks like as this material has been used and worn over time. And I can do this right within Substance Designer so that I can adjust my materials after the fact and say, well, you know what? I think that looks a little bit too rough, or that doesn't really, as a color, that doesn't quite work with how much wear and tear it's getting, just make it more physically accurate. And I can do this all within Designer so that I can get it done, then export these materials and import them into Substance Painter, and I already know that they're gonna look great. So let's say that you just want to export just these materials and you don't want to export any of this edge wear information. What we can do is I can just reconnect the blend that we have of these two colors from our color variation. I can just reconnect that back into the base color, and we have our default material here. And I can do the same thing for my coarse painted metal. Let's double click on that graph. And I just want my regular material here. That's this one. I'm just going to drag that into the base color. So now we have just that. And also let's get that roughness that we had from before. That was this levels, the lighter one, and plug that into the roughness. And now I've got what we had before we added any metal edge wear. And so we can now export these materials. Now to export these materials, we can do it two ways. One way is to create a .sbsar file, and that's Substance's file that allows you to maintain all those parameters that you might have published to the graph level, and then you can import them into programs that have a Substance plugin. Another way to do it is to export these outputs as maps or Targa, PNG, JPEG files. So to do that, go to the wrench here in the top bar above the graph editor where it says Tools. Click on that and choose Export Outputs. Now what you can do is you can choose a destination, a format, where you can adjust it. You can change it to PNG, JPEG. I like to choose Targa. And then you can choose which outputs you'd like to export. And these will export as separate maps. And when you're ready to go, hit Export. So there you have it, 2 painted metal textures and a way that you can experiment with them within Substance Designer to do some prototyping. It's really nice to have a render engine built into Substance Designer like iRay, which allows you to realistically see what these materials will do in different lighting conditions in a physical manner. Also, I highly recommend checking out what you can do with Substance Designer's baking tools. In fact, I made another video about this where we create a procedural flower pot, and I show you all the baking tools in more depth, and I'll link the video down in the description below. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up. It lets me know that you're watching and that you'd like to see more videos like these. And be sure to stay tuned because there are more episodes of my sci-fi weapon series coming up soon. Now, if you're excited for more videos from me, hit subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when I post new videos. I'm Jeremy Seiner. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.